Hope you didn't all end up with indigestion after shoveling down a plate full of food. It's a bit quick. Okay, as we move into the last session today, I'd just like to recap, if I can, the events that brought me out here in 2014. Some of you were here then, although I didn't speak at this particular venue on my first trip. Others of you would have been here last year, would have heard some of this. I just want to recap because obviously it speaks directly to your nation and the way that I understand that God works with nations and is prepared to work, if I can put it that way, with Australia. When I came out here in 2014, it was at the end of a year in which I had really come to be aware for the very first time of the significance of Australia, and particularly of this battle event that we've just been watching over here. It was in the context of an international community that was wall-to-wall supportive of the idea of the two-state solution. A solution that had been proposed by George W. Bush in 2002, a solution, the parameters of which were meant to be confined to the resolution of the conflict between the parties to that conflict, the Arabs and the Jews in the land of Israel and the disputed, in that instance, territories. It was the surprising awareness that the Australian governments had a different position to most of the rest of the world, except I think at that time for the Czech Republic, and which is my wife's country, by the way, and Canada, which was under Stephen Harper, evangelical Christian. Basically just less than a handful of countries that were not going to break the law or break the rules of the two-state solution, and were not willing to impose the solution on Israel, which increasingly the rest of the world was doing at that point. Remember very, very, very basically, the whole idea of the two-state solution, which came on the end of the decade and a half of efforts, beginning with Madrid and then with Oslo, leading on to Oslo II, and then the Roadmap for Peace and Annapolis Conference, and then finally in this particular formula of a two-state solution, it was meant to be a solution arrived at as two parties in dispute agreed about what they wanted to do, resolved it, and the rest of the world would support that solution. And in that context, it wasn't a bad thing that Australia supported the two-state solution. I'm talking about politically speaking now, because they were basically joining with the other nations in the initial stages, saying, Jews and Arabs, sort out your problem, and we'll recognize whatever solution you come up with, without trying to force our will upon you. Of course, the international community a long time ago had already taken a strong stand against Israel when it came to the issue of the land. The first International Peace Conference in Madrid in 1991, which I covered as a journalist for the International Christian Embassy, spent 3 days in the press center with thousands of journalists from around the world. It was very, very evident then, way, way back in history, long before there was any giving up of land and signing of any agreements, it was already evident then that the international community was on the side of the Arabs and against Israel when it came to the land. The nomenclature that was being used, the Israeli-occupied West Bank, the occupied Palestinian lands, these were terms that were out then already. Even though just a point, factually speaking, the Israelis were certainly not occupying Arab lands, and they were even more certainly not occupying Palestinian territory, because there hadn't been such a thing. But there was already a general majority support in the world press for the idea that Israel is illegally in this land and Israel needs to give it up. That was way back then. And Israel, of course, began to give up land. The signing of the Oslo Agreement gave Jericho and Gaza to Yasser Arafat. Was supposed to be responded to with a decrease in terrorism, an ending of terrorism, and an increasing potential towards peace. And, of course, that never happened. On the contrary. And for the whole decade up until the year 2000, Israel gave more and got more land and got more violence instead of more peace. You know this. You know that by the time we got to 2000, when Israel actually offered all of Judea and Samaria, except for a few percentage points here and there, all of the Gaza Strip, the old city of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, everything to Yasser Arafat in the presence of Bill Clinton, offered it on a plate to him in front of the whole world. He threw it back in our faces and went and ignited the Second Intifada that directly resulted from his offer of land in a massive wave of terrorism that sent every Israeli to at least one funeral over the next 4 years. So the whole idea that giving land to the Arabs and getting peace in exchange was long ago blown out of the water. But in any case, what George W. Bush was trying to build on top of this wreckage, really, with his two-state solution, at least it had this element in it. Those guys have a problem, let them sort it out and we will recognize it. And then, however, as Israel continued to bend over backwards, because after that happened, Israel pulled out of Gaza, did something that no other country has done. Uprooted its own people from their own land, demolished their houses, gave the land to the Arabs and said, yeah, you can have land that is ours historically, that belonged to our modern citizenship today. We've taken our citizens out of this land. We will give it to you in exchange for peace. You know what happened. Instead of turning it into a forerunner for a Palestinian state, with billions of dollars promised by the international community to build their state, they turned it into a launching pad and began launching the rockets over. And everything that would then unfold, the Second Lebanon War, eventually the Second Gaza War that happened 2 years ago. All of this history, which I'm not going to go into right now, I'm sure, as avid, hopefully, supporters of Israel, followers of the news out of Israel, you know where this has gone. You know that when the Australian government, in the person of the Prime Minister Tony Abbott and his officials back then, when they said we are not going to go along with this increasing imposition of a solution, after Sweden and then the British Parliament and France and Spain and Portugal and others increasingly began to recognize Palestine as de facto, basically saying to the Arab side, you don't have to talk peace with the Jews anymore, you're going to have Palestine anyway, we're already giving it to you, which has reached the point now where when I take groups around Israel, after a few days they say, well, we've seen Israel, now can we please see Palestine? And I say to them, but there is no Palestine. They say, but of course there's a Palestine. The whole world says there's a Palestine. They have observer nation status at the UN. Of course there's a Palestine. I say, no, there isn't. But the reality is that this Palestine is being created under our noses. And the United Nations and the European Union is funding the creation of Palestine on the ground, building structures for Palestinian Arabs, etc., etc., etc. So the world is pushing ahead with a solution, and yet another solution for the Jews, pushing ahead with a solution even though there's no negotiations happening. And Israel is basically scrabbling to keep a toehold from the edge of the cliff because they're about to fall over backwards. They know what Palestine means. Israel knows that Palestine means potentially the end of Israel, a threat that Israel cannot possibly deal with and cope with in the heartland on the high ground of Judea and Samaria. So your government, of course, taking a different position, a different stand, something went on in my mind, and something came back to my mind very strongly, which I shared on my first trip, and I shared it last time, and I'll share it again now, because I think if this is of the Lord, then it is really what feeds into all of this. That was that an Indian pastor had a vision, which he shared with an Australian minister from Melbourne, a pastor from Melbourne, in which he had seen, in his vision, he saw God give a crown of service and blessing to the British Empire. And as long as the British Empire wore that crown, it was the largest, most powerful nation on earth, the most blessed nation on earth. It took the gospel to the four corners of the earth, established missions throughout Africa, Europe, China, India, etc. Great revivals began over there, and it was out of that spiritually hot Christian environment, if you like, that the Balfour Declaration would eventually come. The stream of restorationism would come from the British island that would promise and offer the Jewish people British assistance in setting up their new national homeland or re-establishing it. But of course, as you know, although the British Empire was so powerfully used by God in the war that we're about to have a bit of a closer look at, and issued this declaration making this promise, so it was very, very much the instrument that God used to free up the land for Jewish immigration in preparation for the creation of the Jewish state. It was the British Empire that betrayed the promise to the Jewish people and closed the gates of Palestine at the very moment when that refuge place that God had made available through your Anzac and others was needed by them as they were being potentially threatened with annihilation in Europe. And they came in, they tried to get in, and they were sent back by the Royal Navy, and you know what happened. And of course, the British Empire went from this massive encompassing empire into an island that is very insignificant in the world today. Continuing on from there, the crown was then offered to to the United States, which would replace the British Empire as both the major powerhouse of the gospel, of preaching the gospel around the world, through YWAM, through Billy Graham and others, major, and obviously their television networks subsequent to that. But but also would become Israel's strongest supporter and ally in the world, would not only help Israel by recognizing its establishment, the first country to do so, but would actually save Israel from destruction during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Golda Meir was at the end of herself and thought that Israel was going to be destroyed, so much so that she wrote a suicide note and prepared to take her own life, and then turned to America for help, and Richard Nixon intervened. Quite literally, as all the evidence indicates, saving Israel from destruction. But then around about the time that I moved to Israel, the United States began to shift its position with Israel and increasingly try to become the umpire, the referee, the unassociated middleman that would bring about a peace treaty by trying not to be so pro-Israel that it wouldn't make any headway with the Arab world. And then increasingly would begin to pressure Israel to hand over land for peace. And so Israel's reliance on America, the confidence that Israel has always had in America, began to wane. And over the last 8 years, under the current president, it's almost crumbled away insofar as the administration of the United States goes. Even though, in the words of Benjamin Netanyahu himself recently, after returning from Moscow, where he's trying to make nice with Putin to extend Israel's reach elsewhere, the United States, he said, would always be Israel's most important supporter. In any case, the gentleman, the pastor, saw in his vision that the United States dropped the crown and would go increasingly into a less significant role in this relationship between the nations and Israel. And he saw Jesus bend down and pick up the crown and offer it to Australia. Now, this was a vision that I heard about back in the late 1990s, and I filed it away, and I didn't give it pay a whole lot of attention. I found it a little bit difficult to understand, and mainly because I didn't realize that the crown was a crown of service and blessing. Not a crown of superpower might, military might, not necessarily, not at all. But that it related to the way that as a nation serving Israel, in line with Isaiah 60, that blessing would come to your country. So when your government under Tony Abbott began to take a different position, I felt in my spirit, first of all, a kind of awakening, and then when I stood in Beersheba on the 31st of October that year and heard the mayor of Beersheba say to the Australian ambassador, David Sharma, if it wasn't for Australia, there would be no Israel today. And then I took a close-up look at the battle that we just had dramatized for us here. I realized, my goodness, Australia didn't only play an important part, with New Zealand, of course. Australia and New Zealand were, in fact, the key to the liberating of this land right at the time when God had begun to return the Jews here. The Jewish immigration beginning in 1892, 5 waves of Aliyah, as we call it, would happen between then and World War II, but they were coming into a land that was under Islamic control. It had been for hundreds of years, and it would be the charge of the light horse and the conquest at Beersheba that would open up the way for Jerusalem to be liberated 3 months later, and the next year at the place called Semach on the Sea of Galilee, your soldiers along with the New Zealanders would play a major part in pushing the Turks out of the land. And for the first time in more than half a century, the land was no longer under Islamic control. This wasn't a small issue. This was obviously a very important part of the whole picture. And so I came very shortly after that, as pressure began to, as the snowball began to roll of country after country, recognizing Palestine up where I live, up in Europe. I felt very strongly constrained by the Lord to come to Australia and to speak to Christians in this country, and to communicate to them the essence of this vision, of this potential promise of a future important, very important part for Australia to play in blessing Israel. And that it will be manifest through the political realm here, through your Prime Minister and his government, but that it was really up to you to pray in that direction, because thence cometh the power. That's where the source is for the direction your country takes. It doesn't come from the ballot box. That's not where the decision is taken. The decision is taken in heaven about who will be your Prime Minister. That's his decision. And it obviously has to do very much with those of us who co-labor with him, called to co-labor as his children. He's given us an authority under him as the sons and daughters of God to actually intervene into the political realm with our prayers, with our praises, by recognizing him as Lord and God over our nations. And so when you go to the election and vote, at the end of the day, the outcome has much more to do with the body of Christ in a country and with how they've been praying for their nation than it has to do with just apparent happenstance in the political realm, or what the radio and newspapers are trying to do to push their candidate, etc. When I came down here, I didn't think that the question would yet be on the table, but within days of arriving here, a private member's bill was put forward in Canberra to the federal parliament to recognize Palestine. It was seconded, spoken to by 5 individuals, 3 spoke against, 2 in favor, and then it was suspended. The debate was suspended because the speaker walked out of the building for whatever reason, and a few of us who were informed of this, and Chris Schlieder here phoned me and told me about this, spent the next few days praying that they would not resume the debate until the Friday because they were going away for Christmas. And that would give time, perhaps, for us to do something in the interim before they came back and picked up the debate again. And so what began to happen when I arrived here, I met with Keith and with Ian and Mandy and with Chris and Barry and a few others up in Budrum. And I shared with them that I had a strong conviction that it was a very critical moment for Australian Christians to begin to pray and act to keep your country from joining the worldwide effort to actually physically divide the land, given especially that God has a day of judgment pertaining expressly to that division of his land. I shared my heart. They blessed me to spread that, and I traveled around and spoke about it. Now, there were 3 things that I thought to communicate, to impress. One was that a biblical statement would be drawn up. The whole idea of Palestine is constructed on lies and deception. Okay, the whole idea. Everything about whether it's Jewish settlements that are illegal, or whether it is that Israel is occupying Arab lands. This is a nonsense statement. It's not true. Or whether Israel is an expansionist country trying to gobble up other people's lands and expand in that way. The so-called war crimes that Israel is being accused of, and all of the news that comes out that pushes international opinion against Israel and in favor of Palestine, all of them, all without exception, are based on lies. The whole house is a pack of cards. But it's lies, and of course, the one who is the master of all lies is behind this. He's the engineer of this. In the face of lies, what we have, our strongest weapon, is this book. It's God's word. Not our political arguments, not our legal arguments, but the word of God. And when Jesus said we were the salt of the earth, the salt being to prevent corrosion and corruption, rather, in our nations, in our world, for me, this is a most important way in which we can salt ourselves, salt our nations, by standing on the word of God, not making political statements, but making biblically based proclamations about what God is doing with Israel, who the land belongs to, and what the right of the Jewish people have, which is to extend their sovereignty over the land, which God, everybody believes, miraculously brought back and gave the land to. That was the first point. The second point was this idea of recognizing Palestine. And together with Keith here and a few others who were involved, a petition would be drawn up, thanking the government for the stand it had taken, encouraging Prime Minister Abbott to continue in that direction, and then calling on the government, please, not to go ahead and recognize Palestine unilaterally. Now, remember, the idea of running with that petition began before the private member's bill had been bought, but that was the focus of one of the focus points of why I came down. And the third thing was, you were in the Security Council of the United Nations back then. You were coming to the end of your 2-year term. There was a threat by the Arab side, led by Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestine Liberation Organization, to bring a resolution to the Security Council that would see the Jews evicted. In other words, that would see international law promulgated that would force the Jews out of Judea and Samaria within a couple of years, and so create Palestine de facto, de jure, in fact, on the ground, with the United Nations Security Council blessing. Now, because of where you stood as a government, it was very clear that if that resolution was brought while you were still there, that you could do something about it. But if you were out and other countries would come in, the balance of opinion would change there, and that opportunity would be lost. So the third point was urging Christians to pray that, yes, the Arabs would bring their resolution before the end of the year so that Australia could participate in a positive way. And that did happen. All of these things began to happen. The biblical statement began its genesis then, which has now come to fruition, and it's now making the rounds. And as I said to Keith at lunchtime, I think this is the most important thing. The declaration It's not a organizational thing. It's not a denominational thing. It's simply Australian Christians throughout the country who will say, based on the word of God, we do not want our country to put its hand to the division of the land of Israel. We want the Jewish people to have the right to extend sovereignty and recognize Israel, of course, as their indivisible capital. So that began. The petition was drawn up, and thanks to the fact that they didn't resume the debate, we had a number of months, and by the time they came back to Canberra, the politicians came back to Canberra, a petition was in play, and it was tabled, I know, in the Senate, and I'm not sure whether it was tabled across the aisle, It was tabled in the House. Okay, so it was in the House, all right. So Christians were able to make that, it wasn't just prayer and Christian kind of spiritual stuff, it was actually a physical, proactive step. And on the last day when I left the country and flew back to Israel, I got a phone call that the resolution had been brought and that Australia had voted against it along with the United States, and so it had failed. Which wasn't the end of the story, because the resolution is still, or a version of that is still in play. Yesterday, France, despite all the havoc that they've been going through, the French president, if I'm correct, said that France still intends to make it a priority to put forward another resolution like that to the Security Council. And tragically, New Zealand is very determined to actually be a major part of that as well. So that speaks to something that maybe we can touch on just a little bit briefly a little bit later. All right. So what I learned as I began to get to know about your country and your history was that Australia has time and time again been a blessing to the Jewish people and to Israel for 100 years. The major role that Australia played, of course, was at Beersheba. But Beersheba itself was a relatively small battle. It was a dramatic battle. It was quite miraculous, and it was obviously full of a lot of courage and a lot of ingenuity, and it was successful. But when I go online and I watch the annual commemorative events that take place at Anzac Cove and in France on Anzac Day, I know that as far as your countrymen are concerned, as far as you're concerned, the really big battles were fought far from Beersheba. The really big price in terms of human sacrifice, those sacrifices were made quite far from the land, as it was known then as Palestine. And I've even heard some people saying that, in fact, trying to dismiss Beersheba as relatively an insignificant event, because really where we really paid a price was in these other battlefields. I want to look at that closely for just a couple of minutes, because I actually think that the truth is far from that. I think that every one of the 80,000 men that died, 62,000 Australians and 18,000 New Zealanders that died in World War I, all of their blood was spilled. If you go back with me to the beginning of my time with you today, when everything is tied into God's bringing of the kingdom to this world, and whether it's political developments or it's battles and wars that are raging around the world, and specifically World Wars I and II, they all have, from God's point of view, as he looks at this planet from high above the circle of the earth, from God's point of view, they all relate to the coming of his son. That's what they all relate to. I spoke about how some armies were raised up and fought wars that would try to work against the establishment of the kingdom. And others were raised up by God to work and flow with the establishment of his kingdom. As I see it very clearly, the Allied forces were God's forces. They were soldiers that God raised up to vanquish Adolf Hitler in World War II and prevent his demonic desire to annihilate all the Jewish people in the world, which is obviously satanic, and because Satan knows when the Jewish people are back in their land that his days are over. Because when they're back in their land, they'll be soon ready to welcome their king. So given that the world wars helped prepare the way for the coming of the establishment of the kingdom in Israel and in Jerusalem, the liberation of Beersheba was key in the battle. It was key because it drove this Islamic power out of the land. It set the land free from this anti-God force, which proclaims in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, proclaims that there is no God but Allah and he has no son. It was that war, the dislodging of the Islamic forces from the land of Palestine, that you were at the tip of the spear to bring about. That was the most important and crucial moment in that war, as far as I can see it from God's point of view. But it does mean if you had won in Gallipoli, for example, and I believe you came within meters of after all that carnage, you came so close to actually crossing the lines and not having to retreat. But the earth was soaked with your blood. And what happened in the on the Western Front, and what you spoke about today, what you're commemorating today, this inconceivable loss of life, all of those battles were necessary before the battle in Beersheba could happen. If you'd won victories elsewhere, there would have been no reason for you to go to Palestine. The Turks would have been vanquished on their very own homeland. So from his point of view, and only the way God can understand this, and I can't understand this, of course, as a human being, but from his point of view, all of the battles that were fought, and all of these French places, and in Gallipoli and everywhere else, all of them, the end goal of that war, as far as God was concerned, was the liberation of Palestine, so his people could come home, so they could be reestablished, so the Jewish state could be reborn, so the Jewish people could be back in the land, back in Jerusalem, and ultimately ready to say, Baruch haba b'Shem Adonai, when he returns, because that's where this is all going. And because we believe in Satan, we know that there is a Satan, and that he is very much alive and well, and that he's still fighting for his kingdom in this world. I absolutely have no hesitation in saying that the intensity of the fighting, the fierceness of the battles, that crazy warfare that just mowed down masses and masses of men, that this was Satan's frantic effort to keep you from getting to your goal. You see, when you take this position, when you see everything from a heavenly perspective and a kingdom perspective, then it's very clear how God has moved in the forces of politicians, the decisions taken by Winston Churchill and others that may have been right, may have been mistaken, how God used all of these things to ultimately bring about his final purpose, which was to free up that land so that his children, his nation could be reconstituted in the land. So for me, as I view it then, what happened at Beersheba is ultimately the major victory of that war, actually. The most important battle of that war, even though it was relatively small compared to some of the others. Now, when I stood in at the memorial in 2014 in Beersheba, and this, for me, a new reality, which maybe because it was so new that I was fresh enough to see it, I was struck by the incongruity of the fact that after those sacrifices were made, and after that force, that power, that Islamic spirit was driven out of the land 100 years ago, that your nation was now being asked to actually put its hand to giving back the very heart of that land to that very same demonic power. Because by supporting and by imposing the creation of a state of Palestine, and by supporting that idea, it means that the very land, the most important part of the land liberated by your soldiers, will be handed back to the very forces from which you took it in war. And you could argue and say, well, okay, these are Arabs and those were Turks and this and that. This has nothing to do with the nationality of the people involved. This is to do with this massive titanic war that is raging in the spiritual realm, where God is determined, even against the wishes of the entire world, he's determined to establish Israel in that land and to keep them in that land and to ensure that they stay there while the rest of the world, shoulder to shoulder, is working hard to dislodge them from it. But that the sacrifices that were made by your soldiers would after 100 years be, I know it's hard for me to say it because I'm afraid that there's potential for it to cause offense, and I really don't want to cause offense. But looking at it from that perspective, it seems to me that something will happen to the memory, to the significance of the sacrifices. If they died to liberate that land from Islam, and now that land is handed back freely, and it's not as if the land is going to be given, it's not as if the land is meant to be given to a democratic country that really wants to live in peace. The whole concept of what this is bizarre, but what the Western, Judeo-Christian, liberal Western world is championing, in championing Palestine, is they're championing the creation of another Islamic country where homosexuals will be executed, where women will have to cover their bodies and be treated differently, and where Jews can't live and can't own property on pain of death. The liberal, enlightened world is actually championing that idea, to put in the heartland of Israel a very dark, backward state. It's bizarre, and yet the world is virtually wall-to-wall supporting of the idea. And it looks at the very end as if the entire world is going to go along with this. From a biblical point of view, we understand as I mentioned earlier, that when Jesus comes back, he is coming to take on the nations of the world that have gathered together against Jerusalem. And that's where they're headed. They're lining up against Jerusalem. But if there's one thing we know for sure about predicting the future is that we shouldn't do it. I mean, not unless it lines up very clearly. We can say what God said will happen, but we mustn't necessarily speculate. We must be careful about speculation, because there is a tide, there is an ebb and flow in the tide in the tide worldwide, both obviously spiritually, but also very much in the political reality in which we live. And we're today in a very different reality from what we were when I came here in 2014. Back then, the idea of Australia standing against the two-state solution meant almost that Australia and New Zealand together would have to buck the world. Because there was nobody else out there except for Stephen Harper that was prepared to do this. At least to resist the idea of imposing this solution. So much has happened since then. When I was first here, I put this picture up in my office in Jerusalem. He was Prime Minister. And I put it in my desk, and I prayed for him, that God would keep him, that God would use him, that God would bless him. And he was, of course, Prime Minister when I was here a year ago. And then the developments took place that did take place, and I don't want to overstep any boundaries here and, tread on any toes. This is your country, and what's happening in your politics, etc., is not really something for me to speak to directly. But I just want to say this, and you can put this in your own. Take this to your own prayer closet. I put this photograph away when he was deposed. And it was away for many months. And about 3 months ago, maybe 2 months ago, I just felt constrained. Go and get that picture out and start praying for the man again. And I'm praying for him. I'm not sure what to pray for him, but I'm just praying for him. So just to say that. At that time, as I say, he... for him and his government to stand alone in the world as it was 2 years ago was, in a sense, humanly speaking, asking a lot. Now, he didn't stay in office, and of course, Prime Minister Turnbull came in, and he had all kinds of reasons for doing so, and he thought that things would be better for his party if he did come in, called the elections. And as we headed towards the elections, I was watching what was happening, and I wrote an article about this, and the article was, "The elections is all about Israel." And I put it on my website. Most of you wouldn't have seen that, of course, because most of you don't read my website. But no, it doesn't matter. The point is, I monitor or I gauge where a country is headed depending on where it stands on Israel. So as I've been watching the American election process, I've been watching the candidates there. What do they say about Israel? And I've watched how Donald Trump said a few months ago that he believes that maybe he'll be even-handed, and how radically he's moved from that position. He's come to a point now where the new platform of his party, of the Republicans, as was mentioned earlier by Keith, is actually totally expunged the two-state solution. It's not even there in the text. And supports Jerusalem united, and even talks about moving the embassy, determined to move the embassy of the United States to Jerusalem, which would be a very big blow for the Arab world. I think the Arab world is in panic about the new platform of the Republicans. I wish I had time to talk about Mr. Trump and the perceptions I have and where I think he might be going, but I don't want to focus on there. I want to focus on here. But what I do want to say is that change in the United States, it's a sea change, at the heart of which there is this Israel issue. Brexit, the departure from Europe of the United Kingdom. Not much, if anything, was said there about Israel at all. But it has caused a shaking throughout the European Union, which has as one of its major points of interest and focus the imposition of the two-state solution. Federica Mogherini, their foreign minister general, whatever, over the entire European Union, is absolutely determined to use the EU to impose Palestine. And they're spending billions of, at least hundreds of millions of dollars, building on the ground in Israel and building roads and building houses for Palestinians in areas that under the Oslo Agreement they have no right to do anything in, the so-called C, the areas C in Judea and Samaria. But there is a kickback. The violence, ironically, the violence caused by migrants in Europe is bringing other populists like Trump to the fore. Marine Le Pen of France, she's coming up in the ranks of the political, influential political realm there. Geert Wilders over in the Netherlands is standing up and speaking out radically against Islam. And would you believe it, down here in Australia, there's this lady by the name of Thank you. And Jackie Lammy and others who are beginning to say things that 2 years ago virtually no politician was prepared to say, and if they did, they were so fringe they weren't even given press time. There is an international awakening to some of the realities, or to the ridiculous idea that's been put out there by people like Barack Obama and others that Islam is a religion of peace, when it's very vividly clear to all of us that anything but peace comes from that religion. Now, how that will all pan out, I do not know. Between you and me and the four walls of this place, I have a very strong conviction that Donald Trump will reach the White House. But how this is going to pan out, I do not know. But what I do know is that a new climate internationally has been created into which your new government, just elected now, has come into position. Now, it's still the Liberal Party, so it's still got some of the good, strong points about Israel, although the other issues, of course, that are of concern to some of you. But watching the run-up to the election, I was watching the ALP, the position it was expressing about Israel. And a few months before the elections were even called, at one of their gatherings, the Labour Party let it be known, even if it was through just a handful of its members, let it be known that if Israel, under a future Labour government in Australia, that if Israel did not move ahead with the negotiating process, that the Australian government under that leadership would recognize Palestine. It was actually a threat. Was put out there. And there were a few other things that happened that led me to believe that if Labour got in, the position on Israel would change radically. The position on some other issues would change too, some of them more radically, some less. But this was the issue, obviously, of major concern to me. And I think, I'm not sure maybe you were not as shocked as I was, but I was certainly taken by surprise at the very, very narrow margin with which the Liberal Party actually crossed the line. And as I watched it from out there, because I was watching it even if Drudge wasn't, as I watched it from out there, I thought, well, is it possible? Will the Labour Party really get in? Is this the way it's going to go? And my understanding from where I was is that Australia was hanging in the balance, and it only just tipped in the right direction. And there's no guarantee that it will stay in that direction next year if another election is called, or the next elections. It could well tip the other way. And I make no apology about stating this with every conviction that I hold. That was a wake-up call to you as Australian Christians to make your prayer focus on your country from now on into the future, supporting Israel increasingly strongly and unequivocally. That was what it all spelled out for me. That's what it pointed to. It was almost like, as I saw it, from where we were under Tony Abbott until now, it was almost like a warning shot across the bows, a wake-up call. Because now it depends on whether, of course, or not you hold this point of view, that everything has to do with what God is doing in Israel. Whether Australia's blessing ultimately will be based on your relationship with Israel, not on whether or not you succeed in keeping the safe school system out of the way. As important as all of those things are, that were on the ticket, that people were debating and discussing, and the policies that were being prepared under whichever government would come to power, as important as those things are, from God's point of view, His blessing that you have enjoyed over this nation for so long is predicated on, dependent on, how you relate to Israel first. That's biblical. And then, thereafter, how you deal with all these other things. And I'll take it one step further than that, if I may. Many years ago, or quite a few years ago, there was a lot of concern in America that the decisions taken by the American president, the anti-Israel decisions taken by the American president, would bring God's curses on America. And Christians were putting out all kinds of scary scenarios. Some of them were seeing visions of massive earthquakes that would see California sliding into the sea, or Mount Helena erupting. Not Helena, thank you. Or something, just natural disasters, some kind of horrors befalling, an EMP bomb going off, something like this happening, that this would be the consequence. But a Messianic Jewish leader in Jerusalem, who originally is from the United States, his name is Chuck Cohen. He heads up an organization called Intercessors for Israel. It's been quite a number of years that he's been trying to point Christians to the fact that when their nations begin to lose their moral compass, when the homosexual agenda begins to advance, when Supreme Courts pass laws that increasingly reduce the age at which, or rather raise the age at which you can abort a baby, as these things move forward, as immorality sets in, as spiritual darkness descends, that is the curse. That itself is the curse. The fact that there is possibly going to be a plebiscite here on homosexual marriage, that itself is already a sign that a curse is coming on your country, because your country is moving away from, I'm talking about the country as a whole, in its political activity, is moving away potentially from a support for Israel, or has wavered, perhaps under a previous government. I mean, this didn't just begin in the last 2 years. In fact, I was quite intrigued to hear the other day that the most pro-Israel prime minister in Australia's history was a gentleman in the Labour Party, who actually wept tears publicly because of the way that Israel had been treated. What was his name? Pompeo, yeah. So back then, maybe what today is the Labour Party's position, in fact, Bullock, Joe Bullock, yeah. Joe Bullock recently left the Labour Party. I had a bit of a confrontation with him down in Canberra last year, because I was challenging the whole thing with the Labour Party's position on Israel, and he thought I was doing a disservice to his party. So we didn't part on the best of terms, although I did try to make it up in a letter to him afterwards. But eventually I was told by another senator after Mr. Bullock left the room that he has a broken heart about where the Labour Party is today, because the Labour Party that he was part of has changed so much. And eventually, apparently, this has led to him actually leaving, how far they've gone from their original point of view. So things have obviously shifted in your country. What is today left-wing was maybe way back then more right-wing. I don't know. This is the case even in Israel, where Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin used to be somewhat right-wing of other individuals who are right-wingers today. But the point is that as you have moved, as the pressure, the spiritual pressure on the country grows to betray or let go of its Judeo-Christian roots and heritage, as we move more and more into a humanistic society, this itself is a warning. This itself is an indication that we are moving away from the blessing of God. And it is tied, according to the Bible, according to what I believe very strongly, it is tied to how you stand with Israel. Which means that if Australia moves strongly back into a position of support of Israel in the coming months and hopefully years, that and if, especially if you as Australian believers go with the word of God to prefer Jerusalem above your chief joy, which is God's order. God's order is that we prefer his nation above our own nations. Why? Because our king is coming there. And ultimately, our nations are supposed to serve that nation. So that's his order. And if we prefer Jerusalem above our chief joy, and if we pray for the peace of Jerusalem with those wonderful words, may they prosper who love her. And if we stand in our prayer time and in our action as Christians, salting our country with the truth of his word, supporting our politicians when they do pro-Israel, make pro-Israel policies, standing against them when they go in the other direction, and we fight on behalf of Israel in our countries, I believe so strongly that the slide in the wrong direction for Australia will slow down and maybe even be reversed. And that maybe then eventually a sign of God's blessing will return in stronger and stronger as the country stands, hopefully, unequivocally and more strongly with Israel. So that kind of brings me pretty much to the end of everything I really wanted to share, even though there are some things that I haven't touched on here. But this is, for me, everything is focusing right now on 2017. You're going to have the centenary. By 2017, the world would like to see the creation of a state of Palestine, or at least Israel on the way out. So when you celebrate that event next year, at that very time, the direction that the world will take with Israel, with Palestine, and just how, the potential birthing of Palestine may be right in front of us. And Australia may, again, be pulled very much in that direction as to go with the rest of the world on that. So I think we're in a countdown time to some very important decisions that will be taken by our country, and that we should really begin to intensify our prayer and our action to try and ensure that our nation stays on course with God's purposes for Israel, by supporting Israel in the face of this, at bottom, immoral land for peace process that seeks to divide up the land of Israel. Now, I just want to say again, the declaration that Keith has spoken about. It has 16 points. Point number 13. We affirm Israel's inherent right to extend sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, the nation's biblical heartland, especially in view of the unremitting call by her enemies to obliterate Israel. That statement I have shared in Israel as a statement coming from Christians. I've shared that in Israel with the indigenous sovereignty movement that is now gaining ground in that country. Beginning in, I think I mentioned already, about 5 years ago, Jews came together to begin to talk about going against the whole idea of the two-state solution by extending sovereignty so there could only be one state. And they've been doing that pretty much up until now. They're experts coming in and advising them concerning the international community's position and response to such an action, that they will stand alone if they do so. But what I told the leaders of two of these organizations in Israel is that there are Christians in the world who are working on their governments to allow and support the idea of this act of this decision of extending sovereignty that they're working on over there. And as I mentioned already, next year there will be the conference in The Hague, as well as the film being made by Hugh Kitson, that hopefully will begin to roll in the right direction, at least among Christians and hopefully in some of our nations, support for the Jewish people's right not only to be in that land, but actually to include that land as part of the sovereign state of Israel. And that will also ultimately, of course, impact on Jerusalem and its status. The movement of an embassy, the United States Embassy specifically to Jerusalem, would be a blockage in the way of the Arab effort to create Palestine. And I don't know if that's an issue that could get traction in Australia, but I know it's the one that resonates most strongly with Christians in the United States, to get their government to put the embassy in Jerusalem. Israel's passed a law in 1981 declaring Jerusalem its eternal, indivisible capital. When it did so, Israel was condemned worldwide. 13 countries that had their embassies in Jerusalem moved them out of Jerusalem, went down to Tel Aviv. And today, not a single country in the world recognizes Israel's capital by having its embassy there. A move by one or two or more countries to put their embassies in Jerusalem could be a breach in the joglam that is actually keeping other countries from coming on and aligning themselves, and would be pretty much mark a death knell for the creation of Palestine with Jerusalem as its capital.
Stan,
yes.
Just for your interest and others' interest, there's one of the youngest new senators in Parliament, James Paterson, just recently spoke regarding the importance of the Australian embassy being relocated to Jerusalem. It wasn't taken up, as we know it wouldn't have been, but at least he's representing maybe an increasing number who are willing to speak up on that. Just so you should know that.
How does it work in your system? Is it possible if you can send a delegation to a parliamentarian to actually get this idea onto the floor? In fact, I think it was one of the senators I spoke to. Yes, it was. It was. Sorry, the name escapes me. The Family Party,
Bob Day.
Bob Day, yes,
Bob Day,
Senator
yeah.
Day. When I spoke to with him and a couple of other gentlemen in Canberra, he said to me, as independents, we can bring resolutions to the floor. Resolutions, if that's the right word. We can submit bills on the floor about anything. He said, if you have a good idea for a bill we can submit about Israel, get it to us and we'll submit it. So I'm just wondering whether if the idea is already out there, if Christian support of the idea put together in some form, communicated to somebody like Senator Day, could actually begin a ball rolling.
Yeah, look, without going into too much detail, it's also true that there are quite a number of those who don't have a faith background who feels very strongly. People like Senator Glenn Stirl, James Paterson, who is, I think, an atheist. Nevertheless, they are still seeing this as something which has legal strength. And I think that's the important thing too. So that there are different dimensions as to how we might approach this.
Okay, yeah. It's good to know. Josh
Frydenberg, he's Jewish, of course. We've now got 5 Jewish members in the federal parliament now instead of 3. So we've got 2 more Jewish members, 3 of them on the Labour side. It's difficult to know how that would pan out. Not going to necessarily rock the boat. And there's not an awful lot you can do in terms of getting things moving. In terms of new resolutions, you have to work through backbenchers to get those things going in the first instance. I'm not hearing you, sorry. Yes, of course. Yeah, look, that's true. People do, many of them have lost members in the Holocaust, of course. But the bottom line basically is, unfortunately, we've got a sort of political aspect to the way these things are done. I think we have to continue to pray into that. And I'd value, and I don't want to take up Stan's time, but I'd value the ongoing struggle that we have to get established a faith-based Israel Allies caucus in the Parliament, having had a rotating prime ministership over the last 5 years. It's not been easy.
Yeah. Well, in the light of everything, basically, that I've shared today, there are the questions, well, what can we do? And there are the responses that have been suggested here, and I'm sure there'll be many, many more. But whatever we do that would be most helpful to Israel, I believe, is whatever we do in support of Israel's effort to extend sovereignty, one way or the other. And certainly recognizing or placing your embassy there in Jerusalem would be a major step in that direction. Why is this all important in the end? It's all important because God is preparing Israel. He has been preparing Israel as a place of safety for his people. Okay, it is an ark. The land of Israel is an ark. It's a place that God is gathering his dispersed people. He said that only a remnant would survive the centuries of wandering and persecution. And in a very, very real way, only a remnant has survived. I made the point before, I'll make it again because it really drives it home. If the Jewish people had stayed in their land 2,000 years ago, they would probably outnumber the Chinese population today. And yet we've only got about 15 million Jews in the world. And why is that? Because they have constantly been destroyed. 2/3, of course, wiped out by the Romans in AD 70 through 135 during the first and second Jewish revolts, and then wherever they went in the world, whether they were targeted by the Crusaders, by the Byzantines first, by the Crusaders, by the Cossacks, by the Spanish Inquisition, ultimately by the Nazis, they were constantly destroyed or hacked back in their numbers. So God promised that He would not forget them. He says, for a mere moment, I have forsaken you, but with everlasting kindness I will gather you. And He's drawing them back to their land with cords of love, bring them back from this horrible, horrible, dark tunnel of suffering, back to their land to do them good. This is His guarantee. This is His promise to them. It's not attested to by too many Christian end-time experts. Many of them are talking about a future for the Jewish people in Israel that is very destructive. But according to God's word, He's bringing them back to take care of them. He will plant them in that land, and He is planting them in that land with all of His heart and with all of His soul. And He has said that the message to the nations is that the one who scattered Israel will gather her and will keep her as a shepherd keeps his sheep. And so He has built this ark, and He's gathering His sheep back into this ark or into the sheepfold. And the whole world is working against what He's doing. Israel is hated worldwide. Israel is endangered from the east, from Islam, from the Iranians with their nuclear efforts, assisted, by the way, horrifically, just as has been in the news this past week, by the Judeo-Christian West that has signed pacts with Iran that potentially enables the Iranians to get nuclear weapons within the next 15 years or less, and in a very short time. And of course their purpose is to wipe Israel out. And the whole world, of course, trying to get the Jews out of the land God returned them to, placing them on the coastal plain in the land of Israel, where they will not be able to defend themselves against the new state of Palestine, high on the mountains that looks down on Tel Aviv and down on the where most of the population of the country lives, putting Israel in a very, very difficult position. They're back to the wall. The Jewish people know that there's no solution down that road for them, that there's no peace at the end of the two-state solution road. But because of the international pressure, the unending pressure on them, they give in, and they've given in, and they've given in. However, the Prime Minister of Israel, a man that also needs our prayers, has been, I believe, put there by God. He has shown a wiliness, a craftiness politically that has really benefited Israel, helped Israel maintain relatively good relations with the Western world and the United States, but nonetheless has not given in every step of the way. In fact, when I took a group through Samaria a few months ago, and some of them asked me why it is that Mr. Netanyahu is closing down some of the Jewish settlements because of the pressure from the West. The bus driver who was taking us through, a Jewish man who lives in the settlements, chuckled and he said, yes, Mr. Netanyahu closed down those settlements, but look up there on the hill at the other ones that he's begun to build up there. There's something at the heart of Zionism. What Zionism has always been about practically is building on the ground. And the response of Jews to violence is to build. You kill us, we're going to build. That's been since before the creation of the State of Israel. It continues today. 2 weeks ago, a young girl, the name of Hallel, was stabbed to death in her bed in Hebron. The same, within 24 hours, a father of 10, dearly beloved rabbi from a nearby settlement, was shot to death in his car. Israel's response to that is to gather for prayer meetings, but not in our Christian way. There's a place not far from Jerusalem called Gush Etzion, a place where 3 young men were kidnapped and then murdered 2.5 years ago. And following these latest atrocities, Jews from that part of the country gathered, in fact from all over the country, gathered where those boys were kidnapped. And they held a prayer meeting. They prayed. They swayed, as they do, because when Jews pray, they pray with their whole bodies. They prayed, and then when they finished praying, they put down their prayer books, and they picked up shovels, and they got down, and they began to dig in the ground, and they began to build. And that's what they do. And they need our prayers, and believe they need us, and not only our prayers, but also our actions. This is not just a spiritual battle, it's a physical battle. The Jews are dying. They are paying with their lives to fulfill God's command that they settle the land. And we have an opportunity to comfort them in that. We have an opportunity to encourage them, to support them through what we ask our governments to do, to help bring them home. We're going with them into their future. There is only one destiny for Israel and the church, and that destiny is the kingdom that is coming to be established in the land of Israel and in Jerusalem when Jesus returns. Amen? Questions? Comments?
One question. Have you been to Tobruk?
No, I have not been to Tobruk.
Okay. My dad's brother was one of those that Rommel referred to as the rats of Tobruk. And the important role that they did, from what I understand, is they prevented Rommel from getting to Israel, or what we now know as Israel, the Promised Land, to annihilate all of the Jewish people who are already living there.
Yes, that's true.
And that's all another part of Australia's history and the relationship with the Promised Land.
As you take the microphone to the next gentleman, let me just quickly say something I really, really wanted not to forget to say. My first visit here, the first meeting I held was with an indigenous community up in the north. And the pastor, one of the pastors there, came to me afterwards and said that his great-grandfather had fought in World War I and had fallen in Palestine. Apparently 6 of the members of his community, the indigenous from his community, had laid down their lives in that war. And apparently up to 600 indigenous Australians fought in World War I. But what this man said to me at the end, he said, as I was speaking, he said, we've been praying here in Australia, we've been praying for revival, for more revival, for the Lord to visit us. And we've seen at times the evidence of revival. He said, we indigenous people, he said, we like to build campfires. And we sit around our campfires, and I have this image, he says, of us trying to bring revival to our country by building fires or asking God to light fires in the country. But the campfires that have flared up in the past have kind of died down a little bit. And he said, now I know what we need to do. He said, we need to take the log called Israel and put it on the fire, and then everything else will explode into flame. That was his take on what I said tonight. So,
could you just tell us what the current status of the city of Jerusalem is? As I understand it, it is still an international city, which does have some bearing on the politics of it. And just for internal information, when you're talking about the Senate and what we can do about the embassy in Israel. Queensland does have some history on this, because many years ago, when we had the National Party in Queensland voted to move the Australian embassy to Jerusalem. It went down to Canberra, it was defeated. However, there's still many members around who can recall that, and I think that that's something, that's a base that we can draw on.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That does sound very positive. Jerusalem has never been an international city de facto. When the partition resolution was passed in 1947 by the United Nations, the idea was to partition the land between Jew and Arab, and Jerusalem would remain an international enclave. But then there was the War of Independence. The Arabs rejected the resolution, which first of all was a General Assembly resolution, so has no weight in law. It was just a resolution. Then it was rejected by the Arabs, which made it even less relevant. And then Israel, in a war of self-defense, conquered half of Jerusalem and made that its capital. And from that day to this, that half has been the capital of Israel. The other half was Jordan, the Jordanian occupied city, and the Jordanians acted as if they were sovereign there, although under international law they were not allowed to be. When Israel expelled them in 1967, Israel extended sovereignty over the city. So the legal status of the city under Israeli law is that it is Israeli sovereign territory, but the rest of the world does not acknowledge that at all. That's its status.
Can I just say something? When I ask what's the capital of Israel on Siri, on my iPhone, it says Jerusalem. Just thought you might like to know that. You try it. So before we have the next question, someone did mention about the fact that towards the end, or before the end, you will make mention of a prophecy from an indigenous pastor. Is that right?
No, that was what I wanted to refer to about this gentleman. Not a prophecy, but his image of the campfire and the log.
Okay, that was it.
That
okay,
was it.
fine.
Yeah. Thank you,
all right.
Thank you.
Okay, fine. Okay. I think you were first before the other say.
Just that previously I'd asked you about the issue of a possible third temple and some of the ambiguities that might surround that. You said just to draw it to your attention again.
Okay. The question was, why do we need to have a temple, in fact? It kind of came across that way. Why should we have a temple? There's some understanding that the second temple was destroyed in AD 70 because the temple had lost its significance. It was no longer necessary. With the coming of Jesus, the veil had obviously been torn with his crucifixion. And after that, we know that the Holy Spirit fell, the church was birthed, if you like, and we became the living stones. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. Now, yes, the veil was torn. Yes, we are the living stones, and yes, we are the temple of the Holy Spirit, the dwelling of the Holy Spirit. As a matter of interest, the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Old Testament, doesn't have the word temple. It has the word house. When we write in English temple, it's simply the house of the Lord. It's the place of his residency, okay? Now, it is true that we are, as I said, that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit and the living stones and so on. However, what God, who doesn't make mistakes, knew from the beginning, and what he told his prophet Ezekiel in great, great detail, so much detail that if you were an architect, you could take the plan of the temple given to Ezekiel and you could go and build a building, physical structure with it. He told him that there would be a temple in the future and that temple has a purpose. Not only will there be a temple, but there will be temple worship, including sacrifices, including a sin sacrifice. Don't get upset with me. This is what God said to Ezekiel, okay? Now, I'm saying don't get upset with me because Christians do. They say, oh, that's heresy, that we don't need a temple anymore. God told Ezekiel this is going to happen. And the question is, what's the purpose of it? Why should it be there? Well, that's also explained in what he says to Ezekiel. Because he says to Ezekiel, this is the plan of the temple. I want you to take it and show it to the people of Israel, so that they may be ashamed of their sins. And then when they respond correctly in shame for their sins, then the temple will be built. Okay? So the temple has a significant part to play in getting the people of Israel as a nation along the road back to God and back to their Messiah. In fact, if you think about it, 2,000 years ago, when the Jews were driven out of the land, they were first driven out of the Galilee and the coastal plain and the southern part of the country, and then the Roman soldiers went up on the Golan Heights, drove them off there, then came down through Judea and Samaria, surrounded Jerusalem. Eventually Jerusalem was destroyed, and finally the temple was burned to the ground, literally to ashes. And 2,000 years later, the Jews came back in reverse order. They came back to the land. They first populated with kibbutzim, the Galilee and the so-called coastal plain, the down to the southern Negev and the northern Negev, and then they established their state there. And then 19 years later, they moved in to the center, the heartland of the land. They came back to Jerusalem. They came almost all the way back to the Temple Mount, and so far they've stopped there. They're on a journey. God is bringing them back to the land, not to harm them, but to do them good. What's the good He's going to do them? He's going to reveal who He is to them. He's going to bring life into those bodies. What He's doing right now is He's putting the bones together. When the bones are fully together, He's going to breathe life into them, and they will live and stand on their feet, a mighty army, as He also tells Ezekiel. This is coming to Israel. But they're on this journey back to God. And so it seems to me that it is in the purposes of God to have this temple established, that the Jewish people will come back to the fullness of Jerusalem, that it will no longer be trodden down by Gentiles. They'll come back to temple worship even. They're on their way to do what? They're on their way to a revelation, to having their eyes open, to looking upon the one whom they have pierced. That's where they're headed. And the Bible doesn't tell us that they will look on Him whom they have pierced when He comes through the clouds. It tells us that when they're in their land, and when they've been established there, that He's going to open up a fountain of cleansing for them and pour out upon them His spirit of grace and supplication, and then they will look on Him whom they have pierced. So there's a journey that they're on, and the construction of a temple, which will ultimately be the throne room or the house of the King on the mountain of the Lord in Jerusalem, is part of that journey as foretold by the prophets. And it's only if we as Christians think that somehow we have superseded Israel, or we've replaced them, or they are no longer relevant in their national context, that we struggle to deal with the temple idea. But if we look at it in the terms of what God has said from Moses all the way through the prophets, that this is the journey He's going to bring them on until He restores them fully to Himself, then the temple is an essential component. It's part of the journey that they're on back to the Lord. That's my understanding. And there is effort, of course, to prepare for the construction of the temple. That's underway already.
I was just wondering whether you can enlarge on what's happening in Turkey at the moment, and is it a replica of Egypt and Syria, and what your opinion is on the outcome of all that, and where it fits in with the plan of God?
I cannot give you a very informed opinion on where things stand right now, and certainly not project the future for Turkey to the extent that it sounds like you might like me to. But what I can say is this, that first of all, in terms of the relationship between Turkey and Israel, we had a very good relationship in the past. It founded on the whole issue of the effort to breach the blockade of the Israeli Navy on Gaza, and the Israeli Defense Forces went in and captured the ship that was trying to come through, and men were killed, and then everything went into meltdown. And Erdogan turned against Israel, and it became a very, very poisonous relationship towards us, not from us in their direction. That relationship stayed that way through the ensuing years of the Arab Spring, which began in North Africa, spread to Cairo, spread in a sense to Syria, and has seen Syria like torn to pieces. The fact of the reality of the matter is that, of course, it's not a spring. It's a terrible reshaping of the entire Middle East into a future that none of us can really predict at the moment. As it directly impacts on Israel, these different changes have helped us or hindered us. Mostly they've helped us. They hindered us briefly in Egypt when Morsi came to power, the Muslim Brotherhood leader, with Obama's sanction. That was problematic for us, but then thankfully Sisi removed him, and he has now a good relationship relatively with Israel. So we're working with Egypt against ISIS and others in the Sinai. The Syrian reality has given us breathing space because they're so busy slaughtering each other that they're leaving us alone, and Israel has a no-tolerance policy on any leakage across from the conflict. So last week there was firing from Israel into Syria in retaliation to a strike that came over. Syria, the Lebanon and Iran are an axis of forces that are all together, that cooperate in alignment against Israel. And with Syria remaining in power under Assad, which is the intention of Putin, apparently that's the way it's going to go for now, basically we have an umbrella of enemies on our north and northeast, all the way across to Iran, that is potentially very spells very bad news for the future. But Turkey above that, right now it's just a really unstable situation. We do not know, nobody seems to yet know whether this coup was staged, pre-planned by Erdogan or not. He's purged since the attack on the airport, and then the effort to get him out has significantly reshaped the landscape in the country, and how they're going to build on that in the future, we don't know. It doesn't look like his position is in jeopardy. He looks stronger than he was. And there are some who believe that he would like to be in the position of Khalif, ultimate Muslim leader. In other words, a very powerful Muslim authority. Of course, the Iranians would have had something to say about that, but that's another story. In any case, it's all in a serious flux right now. But Israel has re-established relations with Erdogan just before the coup, 2 days before. And so we'll have to see how that pans out in the future.
I just want to refer to Zechariah 14. When you were here last, you talked about the peace in the country, and it was a peaceful country to come to. But here it very much talks about huge destruction in Israel at the time, just before Jesus comes.
Yes. In one sense, this is a very deep and very serious topic. Israel's strongest support base in the Western world today is evangelical Christianity. And most of the large pro-Israel organizations and groups in the West, most of them, but not all, by all means, most of them have an eschatology, an end times expectation that sees a 2/3 destruction of the Jewish people in their land, that equates that with Jeremiah 30 that speaks about a coming time of trouble for Jacob, and that equates that with the great tribulation of Revelation and says this is all going to happen in the future. In other words, the Jews are coming back to the land, Jerusalem is going to be captured again, the women are going to be raped, the men are killed, etc., the rest going off into captivity again. This is all lying ahead. And so, as some are actually out there even saying publicly, there is another Holocaust coming on the Jewish people, and it's going to make, in the words of a very high-profile American woman Bible teacher, is going to make Auschwitz look like a Sunday school picnic, what lies ahead for the Jewish people. This is a major end-time expectation on the part of a whole bunch of names I could name. You'd recognize most of them. Pro-Israel organizations, pro-Israel people speak to this future. It's the biggest burden that I carry of all my burdens. It's just not what God has said he will do. From Moses through all the prophets, God makes it very, very clear that their expulsion from the land was the ultimate punishment, or led to the ultimate punishment and the ultimate curse because of their unbelief and their unfaithfulness to God. And the suffering they would experience, including Jeremiah 30 and the time of Jacob's trouble, is something that would happen when they were outside the land. That God would save them out of that and bring them back into the land, and that he would bring this remnant back to preserve them and to keep them and to watch over them and to ensure their safety. Not bring them back to annihilate them. Interestingly and tellingly, I believe, it is what is commonly taught from in mosques throughout the Middle East, that this incredible phenomenon of the Jews return to the land, that Allah is bringing the Jewish people back from the four corners of the earth to their great graveyard, where there he will have his vengeance on them. That's what the Muslims are teaching. What God says, and he says it so many times, and I think if we have any uncertainty about this, we have to go back to his word and dig right into this. He has made a commitment to which he has tied his name and his character and his reputation. Basically, according to that point of view that I've just expressed, God is deceiving the Jews. He's saying to them, I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to draw you tenderly home. I'm going to plant you with all my heart, with all my soul. I'm going to rejoice over you to do good. I'm not going to stop from doing you good. I'm going to keep you as a shepherd keeps his sheep. Come home, come home, come home. But in the, quote, back of his mind, he knows they're actually coming home to destruction. All of the passages, all of them, without exception, that talk about this restoration, bring them back to the land from the nations where they have suffered. Bring them back, this remnant, back to their land and planting them in their land. None of them say, I will bring you back and then I will exact my judgment on you and then I will bless you afterwards. None of them say that. There's only this one passage in Zechariah that everybody highlights. And the simple fact, as I understand it, is this is not prophecy anymore. It was prophecy when it was given. It is history today. The 2/3 have been wiped out. They have had their Jacob's trouble. They've had nothing but trouble for 2,000 years. They barely survived. He's brought them back in this current state, and he's called us, according to Isaiah 40, when he says, "Comfort, comfort my people. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry out to her that her warfare is ended, that she has paid double for all of her sins." I believe this passage, 2/3 of the Jewish people being destroyed, this is past. Captivity again? No, they have not come back for another captivity. They've come back to stay. That's my conviction.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point at which to end. There could be many, many more questions, but we want to spend just a few moments just coming together in prayer. And I've invited Mandy Warby to come and do just that. We appreciate you, Mandy, with Ian. Great work you do with Christians for Israel. And we want to thank you, Stan, so much for coming and sharing from your heart, sharing from your deep convictions and from the things that God has revealed to you. And we want to take those home and share what God has implanted in our hearts through Stan with others with whom we have to do. Again, remind you, if you want to take one of those sheets to be signed up by people from your own fellowship or church or group, please take one of those declaration sheets and you'll see an address to which to return it when it's been completed. Take some extra copies if you want of the declaration. Let that be known and let it be widespread so that as many Christians as possible here in Australia say, yes, this is what we believe, and encourage others to read it through and understand how important it is to stand together with Israel in these issues and in these times.
Before you switch that on, can I just, I would just like to commend both of these people, if I may. About Keith, I know one thing, he never stops working. So finally it seems that the Lord had to put him on his back to give him a break. In any case, he's been through a bit of a health issue. He's getting back on his feet now. He's strong. He's sold out working for the Lord and for God's purposes with Israel as a National Director of Bridges for Peace. Been for years working to raise up awareness, to build bridges between Christians and Israel and the Jewish people. And I know that he has been blessed, and he's also been a great blessing, and he's certainly been a strong encourager for me in this part of my life's mission that I've been on, I guess. And Mandy and Ian, who is not here today, of all the groups that I guide around Israel, their group every year, which it's now going to be my 4th year I'm guiding here nearly, 3rd or 4th year, 5 year maybe. Mandy and Ian are as close to being on the same page as I am, if I can put it that way, in terms of understanding the significance of Israel. And they slave and work so hard to bring people out there. Their tours are amazing. Mandy's coverage of her tour, she's at the end of a busy day, she sits down and blogs the whole day out, just doesn't end. But if you want to come to the land of Israel and you want to get a close-up view of what God is doing there, then do speak to Mandy as well about the vision tours that they bring out. Just amazing. I knew you were going to say that, Keith. Yeah, there's tours on this side as well. Great tours. But you haven't asked me to guide you yet. So not yet. So work on that one. All right.
Yeah, did you enjoy that? This man is a really good man. Good man. And it is our